After 1 year, the NTSB report on the fatal crash involving a collision of a UH-60 and a regional jet at DCA is finally out. Some of the stuff in this report is stuff we already knew, and some of the stuff is actually I didn't know and knew. So we're going to talk about the report. I'm not going to go through a lot of the summary stuff because by now we all kind of know what happened, but we're going to go through their findings and kind of discuss and explain some of the stuff that they came up with and see what's new that we didn't know before.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
All right, so this is a new report, January 27, 2026, midair collision over the Potomac River, PSA Airlines Flight 5342, which was an RJ 700, and then the UH-60. So they abstracted this, 67 people, 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants, 60 passengers, and 3 crew members on the helicopter died. The safety issues were the helicopter route, extensive use of visual separation, inherent limitations of see and avoid with goggles, unclear FAA guidance on the helicopter route that was inconsistent, limitations and gaps in traffic awareness, risks associated with separate airplane and helicopter frequencies, controller workload, deficiencies in safety culture, and post-accident drug testing, and shortcomings in the safety assurance. It's a 419-page report, so we're going to hit the highlights. This happened on January 29, 2025. Obviously, we know that Pat 25 was doing a check ride, and the RJ was just a regularly scheduled aircraft going into DCA, and they collided when the RJ was doing a circling approach to land on runway 33. Pat 25 had called the traffic in sight, but did not have them, and they ran into each other and crashed. The only thing I would say that might be a little bit new here is this part right here. So the controller asked the helicopter crew whether they had the airplane in sight, instructed Pat 25 to pass behind it. However, one of the pilots pressed the radio push-to-talk switch for 0.8 seconds while the controller was speaking, and this brief radio transmission blocked the helicopter crew from receiving the pass behind portion of the controller's instruction. The instructor pilot on board, Pat 25, again indicated that they had the airplane in sight and requested visual separation, which the controller approved. Pat 25 continued southbound along Route 4 while the Flight 5342 descended. So the holding the radio, I think we talked about it a little bit, but they emphasize it here. The NTSB found that the FAA placed the helicopter route in close proximity to runway 33 approach path DCA without procedural mitigations to separate helicopter and fixed-wing traffic. We also found that the air traffic system relied heavily on pilot-applied visual separation to maintain efficient traffic flow in DCA terminal area without adequate consideration for inherent limitations of see and avoid in a complex high-workload environment. Remember that controller, they were understaffed too. The reliance contributed to a gradual normalization of using pilot-applied visual separation as the primary means of managing mixed helicopter and fixed-wing operations, which increased the likelihood of a midair. Additionally, published information from the DC helicopter routes did not provide fixed-wing and rotorcraft operators and controllers with a shared, complete understanding of the route limitations. Aeronautical charts for fixed-wing aircraft did not depict nearby helicopter routes that could intersect with approach and departure path. Yeah, I've flown in DCA. I don't ever remember seeing anything like that. Majority of Army pilots interviewed incorrectly assumed that flying at or below the published route altitudes provided inherent separation for fixed-wing aircraft traffic arriving at DCA. But we've talked about this before. Like when I used to do red air, you would have geographical or altitude separation, sometimes both. In this case, they really didn't have that. Geographically, they would hold them at Haines Point, or if they were going under there should never have been a situation where the altitude separation was all they had. We further found that the Army did not ensure the helicopter pilots were adequately informed about the effects of allowable error tolerance in barometric altimeters. As a result, the accident helicopter crew was flying above the published maximum route altitude. We found that the helicopter crew did not effectively apply visual separation due to degraded radio reception. The crew did not receive information about the airplane's circling approach to a different runway, which reinforced an incorrect expectation the airplane did not pose a conflict. Yeah, because they're kind of thinking everything's going to runway 1. They didn't really understand that it was a circling approach, which put them right under the path. Expectation shaped the crew's visual scan, led the instructor pilot to report traffic in sight. Yeah, because he saw 30 airplanes lined up on runway 1 and request visual separation without positively identifying the airplane. We found that high workload at DCA Air Traffic Control Tower degraded the controller performance and situational awareness. Combination of the helicopter control and local control positions during a period of elevated traffic volume, together with the absence of a structured risk assessment process to support real-time operational decision-making, contributed to misprioritization of duties. That's a lot of words to say. They were just busy and there was too much traffic to put on one dude. That's it. We found that both crews were operating under conditions that made visual acquisition of the other aircraft difficult. Nighttime operations, complex background of city lights, relative motion between the aircraft, and limitations of the traffic awareness and collision alerting systems on both aircraft prevented effective alerting or impending collision. Although advanced collision technologies, they harp on this part that, hey, ADSB could have saved it. Helicopter was not equipped with any integrated traffic awareness or collision avoidance technology that could have alerted its crew to impending collision. Helicopter crew did have access to tablets, so they had their iPad with ForeFlight running ADSB, but that's not really good enough. And they weren't really looking down at their tablets. And a lot of this stuff, they're going to harp on this a lot. And as a fighter guy, right, we run fighter speeds. We're going very fast. Inside of about 5 miles, you should be looking outside. We called it the drool cup, looking at the radar, because you'd want to be heads down looking at whatever the display was or the situational awareness, the data link display, but you need to be outside. It's too late. So in this scenario, I don't know that putting anything in the cockpit would have helped them, because they all should have been heads out looking. And the problem is they were heads out looking and found the wrong thing. So yes, it helps, but in this condensed environment, I'm not sure it would have changed anything. Yeah, and the pilots did not have the capability to receive oral alerts produced by the tablets. So they'd have to have their Bluetooth connected, which they don't have Bluetooth on their headsets unless they have noise canceling, Bose or whatever. Yeah, they wouldn't hear any alerts. We found that the airplane crew did not detect the helicopter until about 1 second before impact, which is awful. I mean, that's terrible, right? Like, they saw it. Helicopter dudes, or the helicopter crew, did not know at all, probably. But to see your impending doom and try to react is just, it's awful. A lack of relative motion against the complex background of city lights, a lack of a required traffic advisory from the controller, all contributed to the lack of situational awareness. They did get a TCAS alert, but because it was below existing altitude limitations for higher level alerts, the crews did not get an RA, and they were unaware of the severity. So that's it. They got an alert. So they said if they'd had gotten the ACAS XA, the next generation, it would have provided them about 8 seconds earlier traffic advisory. They said TCAS provides pilots with limited information about the location, perceived traffic conflicts. We found that with the enhanced information for ACAS XA, it would provide a visual depiction on the cockpit display on the direction of target is traveling, but also provide oral alerts that announce the position of the target, giving pilots immediate information. Yeah, maybe. But again, they're in the stabilized approach phase of this. They're looking outside. You cannot rely on this technology in the landing environment. That's why it's inhibited as an RA at certain altitudes. So yeah, maybe, but I don't see this as would this have helped? Maybe, but it could have been ignored just like the TA was. They additionally found that ACAS XA could be modified to provide alerts to pilots at lower altitudes than those currently provided by TCAS. Simulations using the accident circumstance, we found that reducing the alert altitude would have resulted in the airplane crew receiving instructions to maneuver to avoid the helicopter, decreasing the risk. Yeah, maybe. But then you're going to have a lot more go-arounds because it's going to react to a lot more stuff. Now, I guess in a perfect world, yes. But I see this as something that, I don't know. Maybe if what the new variant is better than everything else. But if it's relying on ADSB, we had a whole thing with ADSB spoofing recently too. So I don't know that there is a perfect answer. I mean, I understand what they're saying, but they seem to be relying on this new tech more than just, hey, maybe we don't build a route where 2 aircraft can cross paths at 70 or 80 feet. I don't know. The helicopter is equipped with a transponder capable of ADSB, however, was not required due to the DOW, Mr. NTSB, procedures and FAA exemptions. The transponder setting was found in the on position. However, it wasn't set up right, so it wasn't actually broadcasting ADSB out. But it wouldn't have helped because, and I've said this many times, the RJ didn't have ADSB in, and so the controller wouldn't have changed anything either. So, yeah, ADSB would have done nothing in this case. Right there. There you go. Wouldn't have changed anything. But yeah, if we had the magical technology, the ADSB ACAS XA, maybe. But you're going to have to retrofit a whole bunch of airplanes. We found that increasing traffic volume, unsustainable airport arrival rate, a changing fleet mix, and airline scheduling practices DCA regularly strain tower operations. Yep. I've said that before. I've flown into DCA. It's a shit show. Something's got to give. Too many airplanes. We also found that although evidence was available at the Army and indicated risk of the collision at DCA, including regular exceedances of the published helicopter route altitude, so this was a common thing right there, the Army safety management system lacked the ability to capture these risk factors, so they weren't really tracking it or fixing it. They knew about it, or they should have known about it. There was evidence available to them, but they didn't really do anything. And then there was no data sharing, absence of data sharing between the FAA and the Army, who were the biggest users of it. So probable cause. So here you go. Here's the answer. We determined that the probable cause of this accident was the FAA's placement of a helicopter route in close proximity to runway approach path, their failure to regularly review and evaluate the helicopter route's available data, and their failure to act on recommendations to mitigate the risk of midair collision, as well as the air traffic system's over-reliance on visual separation and promote efficient traffic flow without consideration of these limitations seen avoid. Also causal was the lack of effective pilot-applied visual separation by the helicopter crew, which resulted in the midair collision. And then there's the additional high workload, loss of situational awareness from the controller, loss of situational awareness from the helicopter, and the Army's failure to ensure pilots were aware of the effects of the error tolerance and barometric altimeters in their helicopters, which resulted in the crew flying above the maximum published route altitude. Contributing factors including the limitations of traffic awareness and collision systems on both aircraft. Yeah. I mean, perfect world, right? You're trying to retrofit old-ass Army helicopters in an old RJ 700. Unsustainable airport arrival rate, lack of fully implemented safety management system, and then lack across FAA's failure across multiple organizations to implement previous NTSB recommendation, including ADSB in, and to follow and fully integrated established safety management system. What they recommended, well, get rid of this, right? The collision of Route 4, runway 33 departing from runway 15, prohibit operations Route 4 between Haynes Point and the Wilson Bridge when runways 15 and 33 are being used. They changed the route, and then they talked about implemented time on position limits for ATC supervisors to ensure effective monitoring. Recommended controllers receive annual instructor-led threat and error management training. Yeah, okay. We issued several recommendations regarding traffic management and flow at DCA, initiating rulemaking to ensure the air carrier scheduling practice do not exceed airport capacity. Boy, there's going to piss off some people. Go to Dulles. Just take a cab. Based on our concern, the issues observed DCA regarding spacing between arriving aircraft may exist elsewhere. Yep. In the National Airspace System, and we recommend the FAA require all Class B and C air traffic control facilities evaluate their existing procedures and agreements to ensure spacing is provided. And then the ADSB in capability with cockpit display of traffic information, that's just money. You know, yeah, recommended, great, but that's money. Who's paying for it? I mean, we used to get along fine by just looking outside. Over-reliance on technology, I think, is a problem. And then require installation of the appropriate variant of ACAS X on new production aircraft, retrofit existing aircraft that are subject to TCAS equipage regulations. Recommend that FAA evaluate reducing the inhibit altitudes limit. I just hope this is not the law of unintended consequences, because everything works great on paper in theory, but then in practice, with ADSB spoofing, GPS issues, especially around DCA area, we've talked about it before. You know, I think you're going to end up with a lot of false alerts, and then people start ignoring those. There is no perfect answer here. This is a result of a poorly designed system that never should have been allowed to exist. They should have held them at Haynes Point, and that was the end of it, just like they had always done. I mean, that's it. I don't know that. I'm not saying ACAS X is bad. I'm sure it would help, but like mandating a whole bunch of retrofitting and installations, it's just going to cost money. I mean, it's money that you got to come up with somewhere. And I'm not sure it's realistic to get everybody on this page. Recommend the DOW. Oh, now we're DOW again. PBFA conduct a study to evaluate the quality of radio transmissions reception for armed service. That's just any aircraft. Helicopters flying low. It just sometimes it happens. We also urge DOW PBFA to require that all military aircraft operating in the NAS be equipped with the ADS-B in cockpit display of traffic information configuration to provide alerting audible to pilot or crew, and such a requirement be by the military for its aircraft to apply in the NAS wherever the FAA requires any aircraft to operate with ADS-B out. Yeah, and also the ADS-B out. So here's the problem with this. We talked about the Twitter randos, right? And the Twitter randos came back and said, it's not our fault. You're the ones who are using ADS-B and we're just tracking you. Well, you can't have it both ways, right? They're going to have to turn it off so people can't see it, but then they can't see it because people turn it off and it doesn't work because it's turned off. I mean, you either have OPSEC and military operations that aren't being tracked, or you do. Or you remove the ability to track ADS-B online altogether, which I don't think people want. And then this other part about ADS-B in the cockpit, this was an old UH-60. Where will you put it? It doesn't have like a display for you even to put that. I mean, and a lot of airplanes and helicopters and stuff have not glass cockpits. They have steam gauges. So there's no place to put the ADS-B in except your iPad. So mandating it, I don't know. I mean, everything is money. And in a time when budget constraints are what they are, these retrofits, it's not like it's cheap, because you're going to have a bloated contractor that's going to come up with a contract that's going to cost millions upon millions of dollars. I mean, I remember when we got the Mode S transponder in the T-38A, and it was a big deal. Like, it was expensive. It cost a lot of money for them to put the panel in the old 70-year-old airplane. So pie in the sky stuff, man. I think it's a great idea, but realistically, in reality, I don't know that we're really solving anything when the root cause of this is a root. Literally, the root cause is the root. That's it. All right, there's the history of flight. We've already talked about this. We've beaten this horse to death. So one thing they talk about, data from the RJ's FDR and CVR indicated that about this time at the radio altitude of 448 feet, the crew received a traffic alert and collision avoidance system traffic advisory, which included the oral enunciation traffic. According to the FDR, did not indicate if the TA on the TCAS display provided the crew with bearing or position. CVR indicated the crew did not verbally acknowledge the TA, nor did they discuss looking for the traffic. You know why? Because they were landing and they ignored it. And that's what I'm saying. There's no indication that they wouldn't have ignored anything at this point, because they were focused on runway 33 circling approach. Now, if they'd gotten an RA that told them to go around, yeah, they'd have probably done that, especially if they were trained to do that. But I don't know. And this is what everybody keeps saying, that the pilot, Rebecca Lobach, had ignored this. I don't think that's accurate. This is what it was saying. He was confused, and he said, all right, kind of come left for me, ma'am. I think that's why he's asking. We're kind of out towards the middle. They were on the route. They were where they were supposed to be, but it's a wide route that you can move within the lateral confines, and that's what he thought they were saying. She didn't argue. She said, okay, fine, and did it. And they hit each other. So, I don't know. People were like looking for anything on this, but there was no denial or conflict in this cockpit. So 4 seconds for the collision, the helicopter rolled 5 degrees left and then decreased to 3 degrees. So she was coming left as instructed. So like we said, that there wasn't a movement of the helicopter to go left. It wasn't drastic, but it was happening. And they were 278 feet on the radar altimeter. So we don't know what they were reading in the cockpit. And then this is where this is horrible. It was a 24-degree nose up in less than a second. They tried to avoid it at the last minute. Crew information: 34-year-old captain, was very experienced and had been there since 2019. Very, very smooth, exceptional at flying. Nothing bad to say about it. The FO was awesome. Had no issues. Had passed all his check rides, and he had done well. There's really nothing to say about that either. All right, Pat 2.5, because this is what everybody's talking about. And there's some interesting stuff in here that we probably should address. So Lobach was the pilot, age 28. She had a FAA commercial pilot certificate with ratings for rotorcraft, helicopter, and instrument. And that to me is significant because you have to go get your FAA equivalent. There's an FAA equivalency test that you have to go do. You don't just get it. So by virtue of passing pilot training, you are eligible, but it's not automatic on your license. She actually had to go take a test and get it added. So the fact that she did that, I mean, she was in the aviation. It was something she was doing and passionate about. Army records indicate she completed flight school in July of 2021. At the time of the incident, she had 454 hours total time. So from July of 2021 to this was January of 2025. So not even 4 years. So, over 100 hours a year. 326 were in the accident helicopter make and model with 56 in the previous year. It's not a lot of hours, and 4 hours in the last 60 days. That's not a lot of hours. 136 hours in VG time, 2.9 hours were in the last 60 days. She's not proficient or current. Well, I wouldn't say that. She may have been current legally on paper, but I don't think she was proficient at all. So this was basically her first assignment. In 2024 of August, she was assigned as platoon leader for new petroleum, oils, and lubrications platoon, assigned an assignment she maintained until the time of the accident. As of the accident date, she possessed a current upslip, meaning she was medically qualified with approval by the company commander. Upslip carried limitations that vision correction devices were required in performance of flight duties and that she must carry extra spectacles. So talking about how she flew, an instructor pilot said that she was eager to learn, but struggled with stick and rudder skills in the UH-60L because she had initially trained on the UH-60M, which was more automated. And the 60L was particularly taxing to fly or maintain altitude and airspeed while understanding utilizing its manual trim system. And I've heard that a lot about just Black Hawk pilots in general, right? If they've flown the newer fancy stuff, or anybody that's flown new fancy stuff, I started helicopters in an R-22. A lot of pedal, a lot of collective, a lot of cyclic movement. R-44 less so, but it gets you that baseline. If you start in the fanciest stuff, then when you move back to stick and rudder stuff, it is harder. It's tougher. That's why T-38, very stick and rudder airplane versus F-16, which is not, The 60L features analog cockpit instrumentation and less advanced avionics. Like I said, when I moved to the T-38A, which is all steam gauges, it was a lot harder than having flown HUD airplanes for most of my career. The 60M also has, in addition to the glass cockpit, improved engines, enhanced mission systems. They had to work extensively with her on proper use of trim and the collective friction lock when instrument flying. He signed off the pilot as readiness level 1, the highest readiness level in January 2022. A second IP who flew an annual combined standardization NVG evaluation, 3 years prior, basically same mission combined, which is what this was, found her performance well below average. He reverted her to the lowest readiness level and trained her extensively until he determined that she demonstrated full readiness. So she basically busted her check ride, and like a Q3, I guess, is the Army equivalent of in the Air Force, and they had to retrain her. So she struggled. There's no doubt about it. She struggled. The first standardization instructor pilot conducted an instrument evaluation with the accident pilot in January 2023, so a year later, and said her performance was standard. And then a third IP who conducted an instrument evaluation with the pilot in 2024 said she was incredibly professional, diligent, and thorough. He recalled that her performance was always very good and that she had a good reputation as aviator and officer. So one guy is like, look, she's below average. And then the rest are like, yeah, she's okay. B company commander recalled flying with the pilot twice in 2023. He said that the pilot knew the mission well and was highly achieving, highly motivated and driven aviator who's actually capable of accomplishing a lot more than I've seen some of the more junior pilots at her hour level who are similar to her being able to accomplish In some of the combat aviation brigades, he added that she was great on controls, great at process management and workload and management of the aircraft. I'll be honest, man, this should not have been a first assignment. Like the Army set her up for failure for this. She needed to be out there getting experience in something not this. This is DV transport, priority air missions, right? This is not what you should send somebody. It's like having, UPT student fly Air Force One. Like, I don't think that's a good plan at all. Our training record, there it is. Because the airplane was equipped with TCAS and the helicopter was operating with MODAS, the crew of Flight 5342 received traffic information about the helicopter through the airplane's TCAS, including the helicopter's identifier and pressure altitude. The airplane's TCAS could use the helicopter's MODAS transponder to calculate the helicopter's bearing range, relative altitude, and vertical tendency. That's what I'm saying. I mean, it was there. The information was there. Although it was not transmitting ADSB out in MODAS, its MODAS transponder capability allowed it to be tracked by FAA radars. Therefore, the helicopter's position could be broadcast to ADSB in equipped aircraft through TISB. Many of the military, government, law enforcement, medical transport had letters of agreement with DCA Tower outlining specific procedures they were expected to adhere to. The LOA applied to the 12th Aviation Battalion stated routes and altitudes described in the Baltimore-Washington route chart must apply unless otherwise authorized by ATC. The TAAB SOP stated that air crews were to fly no less than 100 feet below the maximum altitude for the route or zone to be flown. So they basically had a window between 100 and 200 feet. A U.S. Army standardization pilot stated in testimony provided at the NTSB investigative hearing that Army pilots are expected to maintain route altitude. However, consistent with pilot performance standards, which specify the pilots should maintain plus or minus 100 feet. A reasonable expectation is being off by 50 or 70 feet one way or the other would not lead to a catastrophic event. That is important because they were at 78 feet. So they were within standards of the Army. He also stated that a pilot who was flying continuously above the published route altitude would be expected to apply corrections to return to the published altitude. So that's also important. A representative for medical transport and law enforcement helicopter operators at the hearing stated that his group interpreted the route altitude as a hard ceiling. And I've seen this in the comments for all the videos we've always done. We talked to Austin, who flew for this unit, and they said, yep, the hard altitude was 200 feet. Don't go lower, don't go higher, but you have a little bit of a buffer. But then civilian pilots who've also flown are like, I'd go down, to 100 feet if I could, as low as I can. The reality is the route should not have existed like this. The medical and transport law enforcement helicopter operators group representative also stated the operators in his group did not have an expectation the Route 4 provided procedural separation for runways 1533, and that, as a whole, operators' procedures prohibited helicopters from flying under airplanes on final approach. I think that's standard across the board. An Army standardization instructor pilot said the 12th Aviation Battalion procedure prescribed that helicopters should hold at points north or south of DCA on Route 4 when an airplane was on approach to runway 33 departing from runway 15. However, he later stated that this was not a written procedure or policy. And Austin talked about that usually they didn't see a circling approach because if there were a circling approach, they were told to hold. Other Army pilots interviewed stated that it was not unusual for ATC to issue holding instructions when there was traffic landing on 33. They also said they would voluntarily enter a hold if they perceived a potential traffic conflict. Remember, when they keyed up, they didn't hear that it was a circling approach. They didn't get the full picture. Post-accident interviews and investigative hearing testimony, which included the 12th Aviation Battalion Chief Warrant Officer and other standardization pilot, indicated some Army helicopter pilots had on occasion descended to pass beneath fixed-wing aircraft arriving to or departing from DCA after receiving traffic information requested pilot separation. However, the frequency of this practice could not be determined. I don't think it was very common because the people I've talked to said they just didn't do it. It's not smart. If they did it, it was stupid. The majority of controllers at DCA Tower were aware that helicopter Route 4 was not procedurally separated from runway 33 approach path or runway 15 departure corridor. In a post-accident interview, the accident LC controller stated that Route 4 and runway 33 approach path were not procedurally separated. The accident assistant local controller stated that a helicopter flying a Route 4 would be separated from traffic approaching runway 33 if the helicopter was flying the route properly. Then indicated that she was uncertain and would need to look at it to be sure. So they don't even know. Controllers interviewed indicated that holding helicopters was a technique that they could use to deconflict traffic, but the use of holding was based on controller judgment in any given situation, was not dictated by procedure. Organization pilot from the Army said that was their preferred method of training pilots around DC, and they adhered to the routes as much as possible. Of the 12th Aviation Battalion pilots interviewed after the accident, most stated they would fly below 200 feet MSL while on Route 4 while referencing the barometric altimeter to avoid exceeding the maximum route altitude. Others stated they would fly at 200 feet MSL. Pilots reported that they would fly over the Potomac River while hugging the east bank, maintaining a distance from the shore that was sufficient to avoid terrain and obstacles. There was no common agreement among the interviewed pilots how much they could deviate laterally from the perceived center line of the route, except they would deviate as necessary to maintain clearance from other aircraft. So everybody keeps saying they were not laterally on the route. That's not true. And there was no real agreement on what it really was. They said there was no written guidance for Army pilots regarding lateral positioning from the shoreline. Rather, tribal knowledge was that the pilots should hug the shoreline unless traffic conditions required them to deviate. So they weren't wrong for being where they were. They also reported that it was not typical to see traffic landing on runway 33. Austin talked about that in the interview. And those who had encountered airplanes on approach to 33 reported that they had been instructed by ATC to hold until traffic had landed. This is directly from the interview I did. Most common holding points were Haynes Point, northeast, a building with prominent round white radome structures commonly referred to as a golf ball, southeast of DCA on the east bank of the Potomac. However, the pilots interviewed generally believed that if their helicopter remained at or below the published altitudes on Route 4, they would have adequate clearance, which we know is not true. One pilot, when they were asked about separation, says if there's traffic that's landing and tower has them and we're on Route 4, the way I understand it is it's like it should be fine. It shouldn't be an issue. Another pilot was asked if he assumed that the route altitude provides separation from traffic landing on runway 33. He said, yeah, that's why the routes are published 200 feet and below. So you imagine it's going to separate you from other traffic. Jesus, this is terrible. So one of the battalion commander, in 4 years and nearly 1,000 flight hours of flying DC area, he had flown Route 4 about 200 times and encountered traffic landing on runway 33 less than 10 times. Not very common. The same pilot estimated that fixed-wing traffic approaching runway 33 for landing, crossing the east bank at 500, 600 feet, a few hundred feet above his altitude when flying on Route 4. It had never even crossed his mind that he might conflict with traffic landing on runway 33 when transiting Route 4. However, every time he had been nearing the final approach path for DC, runway 33 DCA tower, had asked him to hold. The standardization pilot stated that it was between the maximum altitude of Route 4 and ATC, a helicopter remained clear of airplanes on final approach to runway 33. He stated, I think that's kind of common assumption, really. He stated ATC had typically instructed him to hold or not use Route 4 when runway 33 was in use. They asked the captains of PSA, 3 captains and 1 first officer. Only one of the captains, who was previously a military pilot in the area, had specific knowledge of the helicopter routes, locations, and altitudes. Coast Guard helicopter pilot said it was common for them to avoid it when runway 1 and 33 were in use, and it was common for air traffic control to deny the request to use Route 4 or to issue a hold to helicopter traffic when the tower was utilizing runway 33. Their SOP said that helicopter crews should fly the maximum published altitude. Policy also stated that the crews should monitor traffic conditions and avoid flying between the Memorial Bridge and Wilson Bridge if there was a high volume of commercial fixed-wing traffic. Representatives from the Air Force 1st Helicopter Squadron stated that they flew the maximum allowable altitude on any particular route and no lower than 100 feet. And I've seen this. People have messaged me from the Air Force side confirming this. They stated they occasionally encountered traffic landing on 33 when operating on routes 1 and 4. They reported that they followed controller guidance, initiated requests for visual separation if they identified traffic ahead of them. They also stated there were instances when they chose to enter a hold to maintain separation from traffic. Of the 17 minutes and 59 seconds before the collision, the LC controller was engaged in radio communications with aircraft either speaking or receiving for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, or about 49% of the time. A complementary heat map focusing on the 2 minutes before the collision is presented in Figure 22. Look at that. Look how much they were talking and where. That's crazy. Overloaded. I mean, you're trying to just shove too much into this one area. In a post-accident interview, an Army standardization instructor stated that he had in the past requested visual separation from traffic that he had not yet visually acquired. He gave the following example, indicating that if he were flying southbound on Route 1 and advised about traffic on the south of the bridge, I couldn't hit that aircraft if I tried because it's parallel with me. It's no factor. I know where I'm at, I know where the traffic is, and I know it's not a factor. So I will say visual separation. I'll have the traffic 15 to 20 seconds later. I know if I don't say it, I may have to hold. I know I'm going to see the traffic. And even if I don't, I know it's not a factor. Now, I've never taught that to anybody. I've done it as an experienced guy. I would assume that probably other pilots do it too. And that, I mean, if they didn't know that they were circling a 3-3 and thought they were runway 1, which would have been mostly parallel to them, I can see that. That's what the radar looks like, which is interesting. That's the active conflict alert between Pat 25 and 5342 at 26 seconds before the collision. And it shows Pat 25 at 200 feet and 5342 at 400 feet. Holy crap. But the DCA air traffic control personnel indicated that the collision alerts were heard often and were pretty common at DCA. In 30 minutes before the accident, the oral tones of the collision alert were audible for 18 controller transmissions. They did not represent 18 distinct CA activations. Review the available radar display data for the final 18 minutes before the accident identified 5 separate CA activations. Good Lord. I looked at the medical. Obviously, it was all blunt force injuries for everybody. So this is kind of the controversial thing that I think people may not know, but I don't think it's necessarily a factor here. But so at the time of the accident, the pilot also possessed an aeromedical waiver for Class 2 flying duties due to a history of adjustment disorder. As of the accident date, there was no indication in reviewed records that she had ongoing psychiatric symptoms or an active diagnosis of any psychiatric condition. Her past adjustment disorder had been treated with behavioral health therapy without medication. She and her therapist mutually agreed to discontinue therapy in 2023 with her goals met. So this is two years prior. She had been recommended for full flying duties after her last aeromedical psychological evaluation, had been granted her waiver after a multi-stage Army aeromedical review process. She'd been found medically qualified for flight duty by a trained Army aeromedical provider and approved by her commander. Cause of death was blunt force. Did not identify any natural diseases. So I think this is an interesting thing, and I think it probably plays into she didn't fly a whole lot during her time because of this. You know, that's probably partly why she doesn't have the hours. I mean, we talked about, I think she broke her foot or something like that. But if she needed a waiver, this probably grounded her for a little while she dealt with it. And it's fine. Mental health, you should be able to do that. But it also goes to the proficiency side of things. You know, if you're not flying regularly, you're not getting up in the air, the stick and rudder skills kind of go away. And she just wasn't very proficient. Now, that puts the onus on the IP in this case, even though it's a check ride. Ultimate responsibility falls on the instructor. The instructor had some, and what you would see, that's what it would look like for air traffic. These are the older ones. So the other ones with the white phosphorus, these are the old Anvis 9 for the traffic. You can see how terrible it is. Collision occurred at 278 feet. At the time of impact, the FDR data for each aircraft showed that their respective radio altimeters were within 10 feet, consistent with the helicopter impacting the underside of the airplane. It's confirmed. I mean, they almost made this. Helicopter's barometric altitude, however, was about 100 feet lower than other recorded altitudes, as shown in Figure 41. So this is what the barometric altitude showed right here, which is on the route. I mean, that right there. Further review of the helicopter's pressure altitude parameters, including comparing field elevations to locations where the helicopter took off and landed during the accident flight. Correcting the pressure altitude to reflect barometric altitude found the resulting altitude to be 80 to 100 feet lower than the known field elevations. Though changes in pressure altitude recorded by the helicopter's FDR reflected changes in radio altitude, the absolute values observed were too low to be considered accurate for the purposes of the investigation. Avionics diagram showed that the static pressure from the pitot-static system was measured by the air data transducer, where it was converted to an altitude based on the ISA. In support of the visibility studies, they flew it on routes 1 and 4. Review of the recorded data for that flight revealed that FDR recorded pressure altitude values when corrected for the local barometric altimeter pressure setting were lower than the recorded radio altitude value corrected for terrain elevation, ADSB geometric altitude when corrected for local height of the geoid. The difference between the radio altitude and barometric altitude values were similar to data for the accident helicopter during the post-accident flight. They flew regular scheduled mission while wearing chest-mounted cameras to capture radio and barometric altitude readings from the right side of the instrument panel. Cameras captured pre-flight checks, flight over terrain in Potomac River, and the return to base. They then downloaded the FDR Pilot changes to altimeter settings recorded during the flight were correlated to the recorded data for comparison. All three helicopters showed barometric altimeter values lower than true altitude, which could be determined from the radio altitude when the helicopters were flying over the Potomac River. Army and Sikorsky provided developmental flight test information related to the altimeter position error due to versus indicated airspeed for the UH-60. In hovering flight, the barometric altimeter can read 80 feet lower due to position error associated down main rotor wash. As the helicopter increases forward speed, that 30 knots indicated airspeed, the altimeter error should indicate to about 35 feet low. By 120, it should no longer be affected at all. Above 120, position error will cause the barometric altimeter to read high. Data from the flights also indicated the helicopter equipped with ESSS, like accident helicopter, showed an additional error compared to the other two helicopters. Flight test information showed that the ESSS added additional position error to the barometric altimeter system at speeds over 30 knots, lowering the altimeter reading by 50 feet at those speeds compared to the 35 feet of error. This was consistent with larger errors seen on the ESSS helicopters from the altimeter. For the previously discussed flight involving three UH-60 helicopters, the Army calculated the additive effects of these allowable errors, referred to as a tolerance stack for instrument error, position error, and airspeed of 100 knots, and a temperature correction for the day of the altimeter testing. Calculation estimated an instrument error between 20 and 45 feet, a position error of 50 feet for an ESSS equipped helicopter, and 7 feet for a helicopter with a clean configuration, not with ESSS, and an additional 36 feet of correction for account for the non-standard temperature. Cumulative effect of these errors and corrections could account for the difference between the altitude displayed on the barometric altimeter and true altitude, while the pedostat system barometric altimeters remain within specifications. Back to the helicopter altimeter. Older design mechanical barometric altimeters, such as those in the accident helicopter, have multiple types of allowable errors that can accumulate while still remaining within design and performance criteria. Additionally, the changes to aerodynamic shape of the aircraft, such as adding the ESSS tanks, change the pressure effects on the pedostat system, can increase the error. Altimeter testing showed that the 100-foot pressure altitude discrepancy seen in the FDR data for the accident flight was observed on 3 other UH-60L helicopters operated by the 12th. These altimeter testing results also showed that pressure altitude data recorded by the helicopter's FDR when corrected for local conditions was representative of what was indicated on the right side altimeter. Therefore, the FDR pressure altitude data for the accident helicopter when corrected for local conditions was likely representative of what was indicated on the IP's barometric altimeter during the accident flight. The allowable tolerances are additive, with the total error having the potential of exceeding 100 feet. These tolerances are not unique to military aircraft. They apply to civil aircraft as well. While a difference of 100 feet would have little consequence at higher altitude, given the low altitudes prescribed along portions of the DC helicopter routes and Army procedures that stated the flight should be conducted no lower than 100 feet AGL, such a discrepancy results in increased likelihood of altitude exceedance along those routes. NTSB concludes that due to additive allowable tolerances of the helicopter's pedostatic altimeter system, it is likely that the crew of the PAT-25 observed a barometric altimeter altitude of about 100 feet lower than the helicopter's true altitude, resulting in crew erroneously believing they were under the published maximum altitude. I mean, that's that right there. Yeah. So what did we learn? Boy, big report, 400 pages, a lot of stuff in here. This was an accident waiting to happen. You had oversaturation of the airspace in DCA, an airport that has just too many airliners going into it. Too many airlines, too many helicopters, not enough controllers, not enough procedures. You have Route 4 that is, I mean, when things are working great, it was tough. My biggest issue with the Army crew is that they requested visual separation. They got the traffic point out and then didn't talk to each other about it. You know, in a crew aircraft, even when one's doing scanning and looking out and one's flying, like I fly with non-pilots, right? I fly with TFOs when I fly law enforcement helicopters. And I still make sure we both see the traffic that they're talking about. Like, hey, you see it? Yep, it's 10 o'clock. You see that? Keep an eye on it. And that's where I have heartburn, is that the crew in that helicopter were not talking to each other about the traffic. The same can be said for the PSA flight, because they were so focused on the runway 33, they didn't really talk about the traffic either. Now, granted, they didn't get the radio call outs that they should have. They didn't get a point out or anything like that. They got a TA and nobody acknowledged it. But that's because there's so many nuisance TAs, and their own op spec says, you know, hey, don't react just based on a TA. So you have that. People that want to talk about Rebecca Lobach's flying skills, it's valid that she was not current proficient. She was probably slightly below average overall, just based on that, based on her career, not flying very much. But none of that is causal. they have pointed out the barometric altimeter errors that they probably thought that they were at 200 feet. Even if they weren't, at 278 feet is within the plus or minus 100. Like, the fact that we designed a route with such small tolerances is stupid to put two airplanes in that same piece of sky. I don't see how anybody, as we talked about before in the testimony, it was common to hold, and that's probably what they should have done. This was a very rare event where they didn't hold and they had them circling. And like they talked about here, the radio transmission of, hey, they're circling was clipped. And so what probably happened was the IP situationally was like, well, they're parallel. They're not going to be a factor anyway. I'm just going to call visual separation so we don't get held because we're going to keep going. Was that the right call? No. But is that this egregious error? Not really. As far as her, hey, I think you should come left, ma'am. All these idiots on the internet are like, well, she argued and didn't want to do that. There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of her doing her own thing or girl powering or whatever. In fact, at the end, they were in that left bank turn, trying to come more to the shoreline, but they were within the established lateral confines of the route. Now, was there an SOP? There was an unwritten rule, closer to the shoreline, but there was nothing written that said they needed to be any farther off of the center line of that route. So they were not wrong there. It might not have been standard, but it was not wrong. It was not in violation of anything. What the root cause, as the NTSB has said with the probable cause, is the fact that the route existed. Now, would ACAS have helped? Yeah. But again, I go back to, this was something that they should never have been in the same piece of sky. Yes, an earlier alert, having a dedicated controller that was actually paying attention better, having them not on NVGs and looking outside, that all could have been contributing factors to stop this. And even if they had the foreflight, it said 48 seconds, they'd have gotten an alert. But in this busy airspace, you need an RA to tell you to go around. And so that technology did not exist in either aircraft to make that work. Would that be something good for the future? Yes, but it's going to cost money. Everything costs money, right? I think when you're in the short hairs like this, you should be looking outside and, or procedurally deconflicted to where you're not even close to this. But it's a very horrible mishap. 67 people died, and they shouldn't have. They really shouldn't have. This was easily avoidable. And it just comes from airspace saturation and getting away with it for too long. So let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for watching. See you next time.